Well, I want everyone to know it's my first time here and my first time talking. So
Yeah.
I need lots of scores up at the end of this. So I went to Penn State. A few of you probably went there. And I'll never forget when I was orientation leader how proud I was to look at the quad and to know that I was responsible for an entire dorm and letting people know how they can acclimate themselves to Penn State. And I just remember this particular person who really stood out to me. 6'3", wavy, long hair, big, long, worn cowboy boots, big cowboy hat, and just had this wonderful smile. And before he even opened his mouth, I knew that this guy was a guy that I was like really curious about. There was just something about him. But it didn't take me too long to kind of move in, to kind of find out his deal. He had been in an accident just 3 months, maybe more than 3 months, probably 6 months prior to that, and he was paralyzed. And his 6-foot frame was stuck in a wheelchair, and his cowboy boots were still really worn from the time that he wore them before he had his accident. But I just thought that he was awesome. And I'll never forget like the times that we dated and when he would park in the handicap parking and we would be able to get out of his chair and get into the movie theater, and I would be able to sit myself in the seat. He would lift himself out, beside me in the theater, and I was like, wow, this is cool. This is like normal. It's like everybody else is. Then occasionally we would run into times when people would park in a spot, and I would put nasty grams on their car, like, how dare you? That's not really nice that you do that. But it was really fun because he looked at life as an adventure, and he was thankful for what he was able to get through. And I was really thankful because he was a really cool guy. He was a cowboy, and every party he brought his own chrome pony. And that's what it was. I said he was kind of stuck up, like you bring your own chair at every party we go to, but it was kind of the way that he had to do it. So we didn't really make it through the year, but I have to say that I really learned a ton about this guy Paul, who lived up in upstate Pennsylvania. But it was interesting. In that summer, I was at the shore, and I'll never forget being on the boardwalk down in Ocean City, New Jersey, and there was a guy in a wheelchair with a really beautiful woman beside him. And I thought, wow, that's a really interesting guy, and it's a really beautiful woman, and kind of, what's their deal? And I was really interested to find out what the story was. And I went up, and he had this computer in front of him, and for those of you who are my age or maybe in special ed might know, he had a Dynavox in front of him, and I looked at the girl, and I looked at him, and I said, hey, what's your deal? She's really attractive, and you're kind of interesting looking, and are you guys married? Like, what's the scoop? Well, it turned out he's a professor. He taught somewhere on the main line. He used his computer to communicate with people, and this was his assistant. And he thought that it was really smart of him that every time he got an assistant, he got a really attractive one, because he had to be with her like 24/7, because this is how he communicated, and he couldn't get around. So I really found the conversation to be engaging, and I thought, wow, this is really cool that I can find out who this guy is, and the boardwalk is a really good place to look at people and people watch. That's what we do. We sit there and watch interesting people. But I think there was a time when I maybe wouldn't have been so curious or interested or outgoing or bold enough to go up to somebody who was in that kind of situation to ask, to find out what their deal was. So I did find out his deal. And I was a little bit sad to leave him on that day, but interestingly, a month or two later, I went back down to the beach, and I saw the same guy with the girl, and he had bandages like all over his body. And I was like, oh my God, like this poor guy, like what happened? And he told me, and I can say he told me because he did, though it didn't come out of his mouth because he uses this little machine called a Dynavox. He told me that he had this really terrible accident and that he was going down the road, and the wheelchair is motorized, but he went down this road and he wiped out, and he went one way, the chair went the other way, his Dynavox, went into the bushes, and when the ambulance came, everyone thought that he was some special needs guy. Like they had no idea that his intellect was normal and that he could communicate, except his words were over there in a box. And it was really sad for him, and it was a time when he realized really what his needs were and how he needed to be connected to this thing, and he was not connected, and how terrible it was, and he's telling me this whole story, and when I think back on it, I think, wow, when he was telling me the story, it was like he was telling me the story. It was like his words, but it wasn't, because it was all still through the box as the girl stood there and listened. So it was nice to reconnect, and I thought, wow, like what a blessing it is that I was curious enough to, and bold, and sometimes a little bit out there, to find people who might be interesting looking to find out what the real deal is. But I found out later that he's a professor somewhere on the main line. I don't know, maybe someone knows who he is. He's written a book. My friend Paul, who I dated my freshman year of college, is a marathoner. He's amazing. I saw him at the Philadelphia Marathon a couple years ago. He was doing 50 marathons in 50 states. He's a motivational speaker, and he has a book that's coming out. He wants me to proofread it, which is hysterical because I really can't do that kind of thing. But if not for the curiosity, I just think about all the people that I would miss and the opportunities that I would miss to get to know people like them.
Nice job, Ryan.